5:2. Of course, I've given, I don't know if it's promises, I've given suggestions that I would wrap up at, like prior weeks, I say at 5 or so, and I've gone maybe 5:02, 5:03. So if I run a little late, it almost seems like, well, maybe next week total up the time and figure, you know what, maybe I shouldn't, I'll give you a free period next week, no class. So, yeah, it's prayer service. Yeah, run down and get some ice cream. I like that. We'll do that afterward. That's a nice after-church event. Okay, so I've left the review up here before we got started. Basically, what I tried to do is condense a couple slides down so that it picks up on what we've covered as far as the second missionary journey. Today, we're going to pick up at Acts 17. We'll try to cover the entire chapter. It's probably a little ambitious, but we might make it. But 17 will still be in the second missionary journey, and even 17 won't have finished that yet. It goes on into chapter 18 some. So this week, chapter 17, we'll be seeing Paul over at Thessalonica, and then from Thessalonica, I don't have a problem enunciating these words until I stand up here. So every week there's a word or two that I just can't get out all of a sudden. Thessalonica. I'll just have to say it slowly. So anyway, 17, we find him there, and then from there he'll go over to Berea, and then from Berea over to Athens. So that's what we're going to cover today in chapter 17. Before we get started, though, Ben, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Thank you, Father, for allowing us to be here today. Thank you for this congregation, the support that we have with each other, to learn your word, to broaden our understanding of what it is you want us to do. Lord, please help us to take what we learned today and apply it to our lives, teaching others about you, making us better Christians. Please be those who could not be here due to illness or traveling, please bring them back to us quickly. Lord, please forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Okay, I'm going to recommend that you take a look at that for the next minute while I ask who would like to read. I need 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5. Nope, that's the wrong passage. I'm looking. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 4 or 5 readers. So any volunteers? We've got Don. Who else would like to read today? Kevin? So ideally, we'll get Kevin with a word that, propitiation or something. But any others? Pam? Okay. And Greg. Okay. And that may do it. We'll see. We'll go from there. Okay. So you've seen where we've been on chapter, starting at 1536, the beginning of the second missionary journey. So I'm going to switch over to a map so we can kind of see what we have in terms of a map. If I can find the right one. I think was that it? There we are. Okay. In fact, here's a slide. Paul's second missionary journey. I think that was in what I sent yesterday. If not, you'll get it eventually. Okay, good. I'm getting head shaking yes. So you got that. It's kind of a nice little list. You'll notice there, Corinth. I haven't sent the whole thing, but this is from Rose Publishing. And so they put in there a way to remember Paul's journeys. And they picked out one city from each journey. So I'm not really fond of that because I kind of want to see the whole thing. But what they used an acronym of PACER. So C within PACER was Corinth. E would be Ephesus, R Rome, so you kind of see where they were headed with that. But I'll probably get that slide out down the road. But anyway, just so you see that. Second missionary journey. On this Rose Publishing chart, it shows roughly around 49 to 51. It seems a lot would say maybe that's pushed out another year, 50 to 52 or so, thereabouts. But we're within it, within a couple years, it seems like. Because what happened in Acts chapter 15, right before the missionary journey started, do you remember? In between the first missionary journey and the second missionary journey. The conference in Jerusalem. And then, and it's, the year typically assigned to that is 50, 49 or 50, thereabouts. So just kind of the dates, I would say not absolutely firm on that. Okay, so 1536, beginning of the second missionary journey. Where did Paul and Barnabas head? Where did they head to? if I can end with a preposition. Where'd they head to? It is a trick question. Where did Paul and Barnabas go? Barnabas went with John Mark and headed to Cyprus, right? Okay, Paul took Silas, and they started, oops, I hit the wrong button. They started, both of them started in Antioch. So John Mark and Barnabas went down to Cyprus, and Paul and Silas headed up through Syria, up into Cilicia, and both of them, both troops, I guess, in that sense, wanted to go back and revisit the churches that they saw on the first missionary journey. So this afforded them a way to do that. So they did that. So they go over to Derbe and Lystra, and just retracing, I'm going to retrace it up to where we were now, since you all are experts and you saw the chart right before this. What do we have happening in Lystra on this second missionary journey? So we started out in Antioch with Paul and Silas. Picks up Timothy in Lystra. And so what does it say about Timothy's reputation in Lystra and Iconium? You remember what we had there? Highly distinguished, very good reputation that Timothy had. As Timothy joined Paul and Silas, was there anything special about Timothy or something significant that occurred? Greg?
He was circumcised because his father was Greek, his mother was Jewish.
Exactly right. So Paul took Timothy and had him circumcised because father was Greek, mother was Jewish. So they go on. They are traveling through, let's say, Lycaonia, Galatia and such, Phrygia, Pisidia, kind of headed this way. Why did they not go down into Asia? You see the path in the red, the path they took. Why didn't they go down into Asia? Because looks like a lot of opportunity there. They were told not to. Divine instruction not to, right? They were forbidden from going there. So they're going across, and they figure, well, if we can't go south, why don't we head up north to Bithynia? Did they make it up I can ask, did they make it up to Bithynia? That's an easy question. Follow the red line. No, they didn't get up to Bithynia. Why not? Too many soldiers or something in the way? Spirit told them not to go there either. That way either. So we see some they were divinely channeled or focused to get over into Mysia and Troas. And so once they get to Troas, what do we find occurring there? I'm kind of thinking of the vision, Macedonian call to go over into Macedonia. So that's at Troas. So they go on over into, they sail to Samothrace and then over to Neapolis and then head on over to Philippi. Who do they encounter in Philippi? I'm probably taking too long in the review, but the review's good, so that's fine. I just did. So, so what do we have occurring in Philippi?
Everything about Lydia, the seller of purple.
Lydia, the seller of purple, so she was converted. Remember, no synagogue. They were meeting by the river. Anything else in Philippi? Cast out the demon. Remember, we had the slave girl that had the demon of or spirit of divination. And that's important because when she was cast out, her owners, the masters, they didn't like that. It didn't sit well with them. And so that stirred up some trouble, which is what led to Paul and Silas being beaten with rods and all. And so they got cast into prison. So it's important to remember the girl that had the spirit of divination and that being cast out, because that's what led Paul and Silas into prison. And what good thing happened in prison? Conversion of the jailer. So you see how all that fits in that way. But there was some, they were against Paul and Silas. The Jews there ran them off. And so they, from Philippi, where do they head? And I think that's where we're at today, isn't it? So Philippi, we see they're going to head down. It says they go through, if I could say it, I had no problem with these words. Let's pick up the reading, actually. Let's just do that. Dawn, would you read verses 1 through 9.
Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, "This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of the God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things, and when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them.
Thank you, Don. So looking back at verse 1, right at the beginning there, do you have any thoughts as to why it seems that Paul and the company he was with passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia without spending much time there? Any thoughts why they didn't spend much time there? They just headed right on over to Thessalonica, is the way this reads, the way it seems.
Like maybe that's where the synagogue was, right?
Right.
The synagogue in Thessalonica, and so maybe not in the other 2 places.
Right, it says in Thessalonica there was a synagogue. So Paul's custom was to go into the synagogue first and present the gospel to the Jews, and then from the Jews then he would turn and present it to the Greeks, or to the Gentiles, either way. So it appears one reason could be that there wasn't a synagogue in those other areas. Also, I would say it's not practical for these folks to stop at every locale along the way. So they could get to Thessalonica and then teach people there, and then the gospel could radiate out or grow out from there, in a sense backfill from where they'd been and even go out to other areas, say north, south. If they're headed south, maybe the gospel then could go out west and east and such. So I think there are some reasons there. In the chart that was up there regarding what occurred in chapter 16 when they were at Philippi, it was mentioned that Luke was with them. Where's Luke at this point? Any idea? Is he traveling with them and he's at Thessalonica with them now? Or what's a clue?
The we in Philippi changed to they as they left Philippi.
That's right. So it appears that Luke first joined them at Philippi, and then when Paul and Silas and Timothy left Philippi and headed over to Thessalonica, it seems like Luke stayed there in Philippi. But anyway, regardless, Luke wasn't with them because of that. You can catch that by looking at that pronoun, they, instead of we. In verses 2 through 4, it's kind of the way I grouped this. What caused some of the people to become believers? What do you see in those few verses? Okay, Paul was reasoning with them from the scriptures, wasn't he? So he's teaching them, reasoning. And so through reasoning, pointing to the scriptures, voicing these words, these people were persuaded. They became believers.
Actually explaining to them and proving to them that Jesus was the Christ.
Right. And so how does faith come?
Hearing.
Comes by hearing the word of God, Romans 10:17. So Paul's speaking the word of God, reasoning with them from the scriptures, and that's persuading them. How much time did Paul spend at the synagogue in Thessalonica? I said it that time. 3 Sabbaths. In all likelihood, Paul spent much longer time there in Thessalonica. I read one estimate that said he probably spent about 6 months in Thessalonica. After speaking with the Jews, we know that, so he's speaking with the Jews in the synagogues on the Sabbath, but we know his custom was after speaking with the Jews, he would then turn to the Gentiles. The Thessalonian letters were written shortly after this visit to Thessalonica. And in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, it indicates that many Greeks turned to Christ. And we don't necessarily see that here. It says many Greeks turned to Christ. So he spent time teaching them. And also Philippians 4:16 indicates that the Christians at Philippi sent gifts or support to him at Thessalonica on more than one occasion. So it seems like Paul spent sufficient time there where support would be sent to him a couple of times at least. With the thought in mind that for centuries the Jews had been looking for a king, a Messiah, do you see any significance of Paul explaining and giving evidence from the Scriptures that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead? How would that tie in? Why would that be significant? Jews have been looking for a king. So Paul's explaining he had to suffer and rise again. Is there a connection? I say, yes, there's a connection.
Yeah, he's going to go and try and convince them that Jesus is the Christ, right? So if they're saying, well, their first reaction, he can't be the Christ, right? Because Christ is supposed to be this king who's going to come. We've got to first convince them and demonstrate to them that, no, you had that wrong. This is what the Christ is like. And then he can say, now let's see who fits that bill, right? Oh, Jesus does.
Exactly right. In fact, that goes back towards the prophecies even, because the crucifixion was a very shameful death. And yet, we can see that the prophets foretold of this. So there was no shame on Christ in that sense, or on the king. This is what was prophesied. This was the plan all along. In fact, 1 Corinthians 1:23, do you remember what that says about preaching Christ to the Jews? To the Jews, it's a stumbling block, right? That Christ, I shouldn't have just said preaching Christ. Preaching Christ crucified. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block. And so I think that's good to note here at this point that Paul was reasoning from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ, and that it was necessary for him to be crucified and then rise again. Switching gears a little bit, in terms of Jews and Greeks, what does it seem that the makeup of the church in Thessalonica was? Maybe like a ratio or what have you. Predominantly which? It seems like it was mostly Greek. In fact, this is going to come back when we make it over to Berea. We'll kind of reference this again. But I know in other passages it states that many Greeks were converted. I think here it said, if I looked at the verse right, I think it says some Jews. Some Jews. Later on we'll see at Berea many Jews were converted. So Thessalonica, largely a Greek congregation there. In verse 5, a mob forms, and it included some very wicked men that were enrolled by the Jews. Do any of your passages have a footnote regarding or do you have other versions kind of describing what these men were?
The God period?
The wicked men that were enrolled by the Jews for this mob. I'll tell you, the King James Version says, "But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort." The American Standard Version says, "vile fellows of the rabble." So just imagine what kind of people these are. To me, it seems like just imagine the opposition to the truth, that the wicked men willing to do evil, even physical harm for a bit of money, they're employed to be part of this mob, to oppose the truth that's being taught. What do we find here, though, that actually instigated this attack mob? What caused that to form? Envious, jealousy. The Jews were losing people to Christianity, weren't they? And they were jealous of that. And we read of Jason. What's Jason's part in all of this?
Looks like he's hosting them.
Looks like he's hosting. That's where these missionaries were staying. So that would have been Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Timothy in this section isn't actually mentioned, but when we get over to Paul going to Athens at the end of this passage, end of this chapter, it says that Silas and Timothy were still at Berea. So it seems like Timothy is right there along with Silas and Paul at this point. So anyway, it seems like Paul, Timothy, and Silas were staying at Jason's house. And so what happened with Jason? Pardon? Yes, for himself, actually. So he could be released, wasn't he? So this mob, this attack mob, looking to do evil to Paul and Silas, they knew that they were staying at Jason's house. So they go over to Jason's house looking to pull out, to drag out Paul and Silas. They don't find Paul and Silas, so they drag the owners of the house. They got dragged, it says they dragged Jason out and others, other brethren. So they take them down to the authorities and start making accusations. And like Andrea said, then it says Jason and the others had to make a pledge or post bond so that they could be released. It seems to motivate the authorities, the accusation of proclaiming that there's another king is a common ploy, and we see that occurring in verse 7. But thinking of that, Jesus is another king, right? So are such charges true? How does this fit in? Jesus is another king. Not of this world. Right. He's the spiritual kingdom. If they were of this world, then he would tell them to fight. Remember that passage. Spiritual kingdom. In fact, Jesus himself taught to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, as long as it's not immoral or didn't go against God's law. So. And at this point, yes, Larry.
I think it's interesting, though, that the Jews were subject to Caesar, to the Romans, and they hated that. But they hated Christianity even worse, and they used the Romans and Caesar to get at the Christians. It's just taking one enemy and to use against another enemy is what they're doing.
Yeah. What's convenient or what suits my purpose at the time, right? Yeah. Okay. Good point. That's a very good point. Let me ask this then. We'll wrap up this section so I can keep it moving. Do you have any other comments, or do you see any applications for us in these verses 1 through 9 while they're here at Thessalonica? Paul, Timothy, and Silas at Thessalonica. Yes, Ashley.
I think it's interesting that it says these men who have upset the world. So
Yes.
it seems like word of their journeys and their impact is made appropriate.
Exactly right. I think that comes up in the next verse. If I can find where I'm at. Yes. I'm going to touch it. That's perfect. That's a perfect segue, actually, to verse 10. Thank you. Any other comments? See any applications for us? This is set so, almost 2,000 years ago, almost, just shy of 2,000 years ago. How can that apply to us? That's ancient stuff, right? What about that of Paul? I think it's a great example that he's able to reason and persuade with the use of the word. I think there's a good example for us, a good lesson for us. We need to be mindful of that. What about jealousy? What caused this mob to form? The jealousy in the Jews here that were opposing the truth. So I think a lesson for us there could be, don't let jealousy get a hold of you. It's quite a powerful tool of Satan's, isn't it? So, anything else? Joe?
Paul had, in his letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy, had admonished him to preach the word in season and out of season and with patience and that kind of thing. And I think this is an example of Paul doing just that.
Good point. While Larry was speaking, I'll go ahead and go off. I'll chase a rabbit right now, which means I probably won't get through chapter 17, because I was doing pretty good, going to zip through this, but I'm not going to make it. But I was thinking, it was what's convenient for the folks at that time, or what suits my purpose now. What came to mind is situational ethics. Is it okay to lie once in a while? Don't lie, right? My answer is it's never okay to lie. And yet we find in the Old Testament examples where people lied. What about Rahab hiding the spies? Oh, they went out over there, but they were hidden right here. So, how do we reconcile that? So my answer, or the way I reconcile it in my feeble little mind, because remember, I'm simple. I've got to keep things simple for myself. It's never okay to lie. Even if Rahab had told the truth, God's will would win out somehow. God's plan is what will be accomplished. So situational ethics in that sense don't apply if it's immoral, if it goes against God's will. So I chased a rabbit there. But any comments before we move on? Okay, let's pick up Ashley's point and move on to verse 10. Let's read. Kevin, would you read verses 10 through 15, please?
And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night into Berea, who, coming there, went to the synagogue of the Jews. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the Scriptures daily whether these things were so. Therefore many of them believed also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men not a few. When the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul in Berea, they came there also and stirred up the people. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go as it were to the sea, but Silas and Timothy abode there still. And they conducted Paul, brought him to Athens, and having received a commandment to Silas and Timothy, were to come to him with all speed, they departed.
Thank you. So back to Ashley's point. Looking back at verse 10, verse 10 says, Paul and Silas' lives were in danger, so the brethren sent them out by cover of night, really. But then looking back at verse 6, which is what Ashley was referring to, these men who have upset the world have come here also. So now Paul and Silas have been sent out. It could be that this is what the authorities wanted anyway, because these folks have upset the world and now they've come here. We want them out of here. And so, who knows? Don't know if that's what part of the pledge was or the bond. Don't really know there, but it's interesting how I like that phrase. These men have upset the world. So I wanted to tie that in. And now Paul and Silas have moved on. Paul and Silas, I think, would have been, in a sense, ineffective at this point anyway, because if they'd been out in public preaching, proclaiming the gospel, they would have been seized again and thrown in jail, in that sense, then ineffective. So they move on to Berea. But since they moved on and they, in a sense, I'm going to say, slipped out by cover of night so that the authorities couldn't seize them again, or the mob, or what have you, does that seem to be indicative that their efforts failed at Thessalonica? I see some emphatic no's. I would say no, because the gospel took root and a new congregation of Christians was planted. I mean, we see the brethren taking them and sending them out. Says some believed, so the gospel took root. In verses 11 and 12, it says that these were more noble. Who is it referring to in this passage? Who was more noble? Okay, I'm hearing two answers, which is good. I'm hearing the Bereans. I'm hearing the Jews. Both are correct. Can I say more correct? The one that's more correcter is, no, I think it's referring to the Jews specifically. Because Paul goes, what's his custom? Goes to the synagogue. He's teaching the Jews. And it says, these were more noble than those who were at Thessalonica. It's the Jews at Thessalonica that were stirring up all the trouble and had enlisted the riffraff to get that mob and come after them. Here in this passage, verse 11 and 12, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Therefore, many of them believed. Remember, they went to the synagogue. Now, many of them believed. And then, along with a number of prominent Greek women and men. So many of them believed, I think, is referring to the Jews. And then it says, along with Greeks as well. So, interesting to see the difference in the Jewish, I'll say the Jewish, not so much the mindset, but the different groups of people there. How some were willing, they were open to receiving the truth. But how was it that they were considered to be more noble? Kind of goes along with open to being to receiving the truth. What made them more noble? They opened up the scriptures to see if it was true. So they searched the scriptures. They're eager for truth. Look into God's word. What they're saying, yep, that's, these prophecies show and points that is true, points to Christ. Rather than just being closed-minded and, apparently like the majority of the Jews at Thessalonica, they're teaching Christianity, not Judaism, and so we're going to run them off. So, let's see what else I had for you here. In fact, I made a note for myself too. In the New American Standard Version, it says, they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. The King James Version and the American Standard Version use the clause of, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind. I like that mind. They're searching the scriptures, reasoning, logic. Is this true? So, okay. In fact, there's a New Testament passage. Timothy's with them. It's a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy that comes to mind regarding searching the scriptures. Just come to your mind too? What would it be? Read my mind. Study. Joe got it.
Study to show yourself approved.
That's right. Study to show yourself approved. A workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly or accurately handling the word of truth. So, yeah, good. So there's a lesson application for us right there. I like to try to look for some sort of application, even in these ancient things. It's still true, isn't it? The word doesn't change. So, let's see, verses 13 through 15 that was read. It's like, again, notice how strongly the Jews in Thessalonica opposed the truth. So strongly. So much so that they went to another town. Those Jews in Thessalonica followed them to Berea to agitate and stir up the people against the gospel. At the end of verse 15, where do we find Paul, Silas, and Timothy? Okay. Are all three in Athens? Not yet. Paul's in Athens, so perfect, excellent. So what we've covered in 17 so far is, the end of 16, they go from Philippi over to Thessalonica. So we picked up at Thessalonica in verse 1. From Thessalonica, then they go down to Berea. And now from Berea, they're headed over to Athens. But Paul gets to Athens first. And then he tells those who escorted him there, tells them, go back and give word to Silas and Timothy to come join me in Athens as soon as they can. So Silas and Timothy are still in Berea. Paul is now in Athens. We'll wrap this section up and then I can get into Athens. Any comments or applications that you see in this section of verses 10 through 15? Any comments? Joe already mentioned one, the importance of studying the scriptures so we can ascertain the truth. What about, do you see anything in verse 15? What happens in verse 15? Did they send Paul on his way? Head out of town, head south. I think it's south. Head south. You probably want to end up in Athens. Is that how they handled that? They escorted him there. So in my mind, what I see there is these brethren went out of their way, probably significantly out of the way, because they were concerned about Paul. They wanted to ensure his safety and that he got there safely, where he was headed. So I think that's great encouragement to Paul, and I would think it's also great encouragement to to the Christians at Berea, and especially those who escorted him there, to have that company there. Any other comments? Berea. Okay. So let's read verses 16 through 21. Pam, would you read those? 16 through 21.
Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue and with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who
Thank you, Pam. I wanted to point out on the map, Philippi, and then chapter 17, we picked them up in Thessalonica. From Thessalonica, they went down to Berea. And then from Berea, remember, there were several Bereans that escorted them all the way over here to Athens. So when I say they went significantly out of the way, it appears they really did. So now Paul is down here in Athens. The escorts are going to head back to Berea and be given the message, give the message to Timothy and Silas to, hey, come join me in Athens as soon as you can. So I kind of wanted to tie in the map there. There in verse 16, do we have any emotional insight into Paul as he walked through Athens? Is there any insight? He's upset by all those idols. And I think it could be called righteous anger, right? Righteous indignation. Athens was replete with idols. And so I think he was annoyed that the city was so full of idolatry. I think we see that. It's kind of boiling up in him. In verse 17, what do we find that Paul was doing every day? He's teaching every day, reasoning with the people. And that is, meaning he's explaining logically why Christ is the Savior and trying to persuade them to be Christians or to be followers of Christ. We find in verse 18, Epicureans are mentioned. Do any of you recall something significant about the Epicureans, or can you think of just a couple one or two words that might be a good trigger to remember who the Epicureans were or what their thoughts were? Okay, and I won't dwell long on that. I had to look it up, so I'll just read what I came up with. Philosophers, right. There was a train or line of philosophy, Epicureans and the Stoics. So Epicureans, I would say probably a key word to remember for the Epicureans is pleasure. So for those that like to mark in their Bibles, maybe pleasure was a key thought of theirs. And so I wanted to read, here's one descriptive background on the Epicureans that I came across. It says, the Epicureans followed the teachings of Epicurus. He lived 342 to 270 BC, so a couple centuries, 3 centuries earlier. Epicurus taught that the highest good was to be found in seeking pleasure, which was defined as the absence of pain. The pleasure he advocated did not involve a hedonistic, sensuous lifestyle. It involved the avoidance of trouble, freedom from problems, and tranquility of mind. This meant sometimes avoiding sensuous pleasures that could lead to trouble. Moreover, Epicureans were materialists, believing that man is completely material and has no existence beyond this life. They did not believe in divine creation, divine punishment of evildoers, or divine providence. Another way to sum them up might be eat, drink, and be merry. But pleasure. So it's key as we get into the Sermon on Mars Hill, they did not, they're materialistic and did not believe in immortality in that sense. Now, Stoics was also mentioned, and so a couple key words that I've heard associated with the Stoics would be apathy and indifference. Stoic philosophers, well, another thing, I'll just read this to you, another passage or background I came across on the Stoics. Stoic philosophers were advocates of the theory originally taught by Zeno of Cyprus, who died in 264 BC. He lived to the age of 96. Because he regularly held his classes on one of the porches in the marketplace, his followers were called Stoics, from the Greek word stoa, which means porch. So doctrines of the Stoics included the world was created by Zeus, all things were governed by the Fates, to whom, that's Fates, F-A-T-E-S, to whom Zeus himself was subject. Self-denial was thought to contribute to the highest end in life. Passions and affections were to be suppressed and restrained, kind of a grin and bear it attitude. Apathy or indifference to either pleasure or pain, or mastery over all desires and lusts, so that none gained control of the man. These were what the Stoics aimed for. They denied immortality of the soul. So again, that comes into play with Paul's sermon on Mars Hill that we'll get to in just a moment. So with the Stoics, think of apathy, indifference. In fact, we use that term, I'll use that term every now and then about if I'm trying not to show any emotion, I'm just going to be stoic. So common word we use today. Apathy, indifference. With Epicureans, pleasure, eat, drink, be merry. Kind of as we're looking at a couple different definitions there, in verse 18, the New American Standard Bible uses the word babbler for the name calling that was given to Paul, babbler. Some of your marginal notes may indicate this word to be seed picker. And you might wonder, how does that come across? Babbler to seed picker. Originally, that Greek word had reference to the less fortunate, those that would go out and glean the fields after the harvest. So, seed picker. Then it became applied to those who hung around in the marketplace, picking up scraps and making their living off of that. So in the marketplace now, picking up scraps. And think of Athens, a place of philosophy. So then that word became applied to men who picked up scraps of information here and there and then tried to palm them off as their own. So it was a term used for an ignorant plagiarist. Not his original thought, but he's trying to pass it off as his own. So he's a seed picker. He picks up this, that, a thought here, a thought there, passes it off. And so this is a term we find that they use for Paul, babbler, a seed picker. Why would this, even within this section that we're going to read, that we read, how do we see that this really is not an accurate term for Paul? He's not a seed picker. Yes, Paul is very learned. Joe, I think.
It seems kind of an odd thing to call him when they're saying, hey, you're bringing us something new.
Exactly. Good point.
That
That's
seems
right.
kind of a contradictory idea.
Yes. So the Athenians, well-cultured, I guess one way to look at it and all, and yet Paul's presenting something new. Come, let's go over to the Areopagus or Mars Hill. Tell us about this. Is this a foreign god, a strange god? It's something new. What are you going to tell us? That's not taking something old and information from someone else and passing it off as his own. So seed picker doesn't apply. He's not taking that scrap of information. In fact, where is he getting his information? It's like divine revelation, isn't it? It's truth. It's the word from God. So, Joe?
I think to me, it strikes me more of an effort to dismiss it. It's like he must have just picked this up somewhere. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yep.
I think that's probably more what they're talking about.
Yep.
But it still seems contradictory.
Yes. Good point. Good point. Any other comments there? Okay. Areopagus means hill of Ares. The Roman equivalent of Ares is Mars. So that's why some of your translations may say Mars Hill, some may say Areopagus. In verse 21, looking at verse 21, if I can find that. Verse 21, interesting statement there that's made. Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. We have a phrase we use every now and then. Hey, what's new? Well, it's said that the phrase they used was, what's newer? Always something new, something new. And this was so deeply ingrained in their culture. And so demonstrative of this was 400 years earlier, Demosthenes had rebuked the Athenians for idling away their time in the forum, asking about the latest news concerning the movements of Philip of Macedon, who was then rising to power, when they should have been preparing for battle. So that's 4 centuries prior, and it's what's newer. That just seemed to be, they were, the philosophers, that's how they were. So Philip of Macedon, kind of as a side note, we were looking at Philippi of Macedonia. That's where the name came from. Philip, named the town Philippi. So Philippi of Macedonia, Philip of Macedon. Just kind of a side note. Before going on into the Mars Hill, do I have time? You know what? I don't have time to get through it. If I kept it to 5, then we could not have class next week, though. No, I should probably stop there and we'll pick up at the Mars Hill. It's 5:2. I'd like to at least read it, but I need not to do that. So any final comments, applications, gleanings for us? Don?
The
Yes, good point. Yes, Philip of Macedon was Alexander the Great's father. And look at the Greek influence that Alexander had as he went through conquering, right? Any other comments? Applications for us? Okay, in 2 weeks, pick up at the Sermon on Mars Hill. So we'll revisit this just a little bit, but then we'll get into Mars Hill. But probably good because we'll go on into chapter 18 since we're 17 wouldn't finish the second missionary journey anyway. And men, if you'd like to substitute for me for receiving the emails on the prayer service and just making sure that they're included, let me know. Otherwise, we'll figure it out. We'll make an assignment come Wednesday. You're dismissed.